By all standards, that is a silly little motorcycle. It's a 2000 Yamaha 250 Virago. And I didn't acquire this thing because I wanted it. I had no desire for it whatsoever. But last year we were thinking about doing a motorcycle channel, a spin-off on this one. And so I started acquiring bikes to do projects with and revivals and so on and so forth. So this thing pops up on Facebook Marketplace. Guy wanted 400 bucks for it. It was intact. And I gave him the 400, but I overpaid for it. It had been sitting in his backyard for years. The tires were sunk into the dirt. It was covered with moss and mold and with critters, and it had like an infestation. It was a mess, right? I says, all right, it's there, it's intact. Here's a 400 bucks on it. Took the bike home. So, long story short, the channel never materialized. I got rid of a bunch of the bikes that I had and kept this one around. I had this one just sitting in the shop. So I decided, well, I don't need another door stop. Let's see if we can get this thing running. Because it cleaned up nice. I hit it with the pressure washer and it cleaned up. It looked pretty good. So I says, let me turn this thing into a motorcycle. Let's get it running and see how it is. So I do that. I went through the carburetor. I freed up the brakes. Just lots of little things. You know, the normal little things that happen when a bike sits for a long time. And all done. And I take it for a ride. And I go I take it like for a 20-mile ride. And I'm like, you know, this bike is good. It's solid, does everything it's supposed to do. But it's like, it's this silly little bike. You know, I have no use for this thing. I bring it back to the shop. And one day I'm talking to my kid. And he mentions to me that he may want to learn how to ride motorcycles. And I says, have I got the bike for you? I says, I got this little 250 Virago. I says, this is the perfect bike for a beginner. They're intended to be beginner bikes and for women. They have a very low seat height, and the thing only weighs about 300 pounds, 320 pounds. I says, this is the perfect bike for you to learn to ride on, master your skills, and then we'll go find you a bigger bike. So I drop this thing off over at his house, and he rides it a couple of times, and then it just sits in his garage. And it sits and it sits and it sits, and the girls play on it, and the battery goes dead, and it starts to like deteriorate, right? So about 2 months ago, I go to his house and I pick it up and I bring it back to the shop, and I'm like, all right, let's do a revival on this thing and see where it goes from there. So I do that and get the bike all back into shape, throw a new battery in it, and I take it for a ride. And I'm still not impressed. I'm like, you know, it's too nice to like scrap, right? But it's not really nice enough to call a motorcycle. But it's perfect for a learner, perfect for like my kid to learn how to ride a bike. And then a funny thing happens, right? So it's been sitting around, and now it's summer in Middle Tennessee. And this is like living in a postcard. The landscape around me is just beautiful. It's loaded with these winding roads and hills, and just, it's the perfect environment for like that early morning, you know, through the countryside motorcycle thing. And I start doing it. Every morning it becomes a routine now. I come in, I have my coffee, and then before I get involved in anything else, I just got into the habit of I jump on this thing and I take it for a 20-30 mile ride through the countryside. And little by little, it started to grow on me, and I started to like really appreciate the virtues of this bike. It is a silly little bike, but sometimes silly little bikes have their place. So let me give you the history, the rundown on these things, and then I'll explain the pros and the cons and why you may want to look for something similar to this. It's a 2000 VStar 250. So this bike was introduced as the Virago 250 in 1988, and it has run mechanically completely unchanged from 1988 until today. So right now you can go to the Yamaha dealer, buy this exact bike mechanically just the way it sits, and it costs you just around 4,600 bucks plus whatever it takes to get it out the door. But the bike is completely unchanged. And then on top of that, there's a Chinese company called Lifan that started cloning these things. So you could buy them offline through all different sources and stuff like that at even cheaper prices, all brand new. And there's an abundance of them out there, you know, that people have bought over the years as beginner bikes and lost interest in it, outgrew it, whatever, and the bikes just sit. So there are a ton of these things out there, and they can be had for a song. I overpaid the 400 bucks I paid for this one. So let me tell you what I don't like about the bike, and then I'll tell you what I do like about the bike, right? So the downsides to this thing, it has some weirdnesses. It has some weirdnesses. So the first thing you have to notice or note about this bike is that it is not 250 sized. You would think, you know, you say, well, it's a 250, it's got to be like a 250 Rebel, right? It's going to be like just an undersized little thing, but it's not. This bike, when I parked this next to my Sportster, and the Sportster to me is the default motorcycle. It is just about exactly the same in every dimension as my Sportster. It has like a ½ inch shorter wheelbase, but it's actually wider through the tank, the seat, and the back fender than the Sportster. So it's a Sportster sized bike. It has a look that says it's much bigger than what it is. It has a look that says it's bigger than a Sportster, just the way it's laid out. And I like that about this bike. Now what's weird about that is that I've always associated Yamahas with smaller bikes. When I was, you know, years ago, I was into Yamaha 2-strokes, R5s, RDs, tiny bikes compared to like the Kawasaki triples or the Suzuki. The Suzukis were giants. And then the sport bike thing came along, like in the late 90s, early 2000s. And every Yamaha sport bike I ever rode, the R6, R1, I always felt that they were too small. I didn't feel comfortable on the bikes. I'm 5'10". But when you got into like full tuck on one of those bikes, and you know, you were on it, it was kind of unnerving because your head was like over the headlight. You know what I mean? It was like they built them just a little bit too small. And I've always associated that as Yamaha builds stuff that's just a little too small. This is the exact opposite. It's a little too big to be a 250. And that's one of the things that makes it fantastic. It's light. The bike only weighs about 320 pounds. So it's like, it's friendly. But wait, let's go back to the weirdnesses, the stuff that I don't like about it. And then we'll talk about its virtues. So this is minor, it's minor, but the original owner on this bike took the back seat off. They put a puffy pillion seat on these things. They kind of like wrecks the line of the bike. You know, you got a nice line, and then it comes to this back seat and it's just woof, like that, right? So the original owner, or the previous owner of the bike, had removed that, and I tell you, it cleans up the side of the bike, the side view of the bike perfectly. It's a 250, it's a little 250. How many times are you going to be riding a chick around on the back of your little 250, right? It's not necessary. Let her sit on the fender. Just let her sit on the fender. It looks clean like that. But that, from stock, that's a little awkward. All right. The exhaust. Okay, here's ultimate weirdness, right? So it has a very Harley looking exhaust on it. The front pipe is live. Okay, so the pipe and this bottom muffler are live. The back pipe, this part of it, is a dummy, right? It bolts onto a flange over here, and then it dead ends someplace around here in the muffler. No exhaust ever goes through this pipe. Instead, the exhaust is behind it, and I don't know if you can see where my hand is. So there's for the back pipe. I have no idea why they did this. There are aftermarket exhausts available on this bike that are true 2-in-2s. But for some reason, Yamaha decided back in '88, and they continued to this very day with this exact setup with this dummy pipe. So this is live, comes all the way to the back like you would expect. This dead ends here. Then this pipe comes up, joins the muffler here, so you've got like an intersection between the two exhausts. And then there's a coupler between the bottom muffler and the top muffler. So half the exhaust goes to the top muffler, half the exhaust goes to the bottom. It's crazy. I have no idea why they did this, but it's there. All right. So there's a weirdness. If this was like a long-term project bike, something I really wanted to put some equity into, I would get rid of this exhaust. But as it is, it's fine. And the way this bike is being used, it's fine. And it sounds good. And we'll get to that in a minute. I'll fire it up in a minute. Other weirdnesses are the Virago pods. And this has the pods just like the other Viragos. So this one here is essentially a dummy pod. It's got some kind of relay in there, but it could have been placed anyplace else, under the tank or under the seat. There's a relay in there, but other than that, it's just a big empty pod. A big, giant, huge, empty chrome plastic pod on the side of the bike. This side here is the air filter. So all of these Viragos, regardless of size, have the air cleaner assembly in the pod. They run the carburetor up into the bike, into the backbone of the bike, and then the air filter is in here. So that's the purpose for this pod. But it could have been done differently. It's like two big giant chrome tumors on the side of an otherwise really slick little bike. The forward controls, you know, they're okay, a little spindly, you know, compared to if you're accustomed to riding, let's say, a Harley with forward controls. They feel a little cheap, a little spindly, but they work. And honestly, that's probably it as far as like the negative aspects of the bike. On the positive side, like I said, the size is perfect. You would never know you were riding a 250. The size of this bike combined with the really lightweight is kind of a mind job, because you look at the bike, you say, well, okay, there's going to be some substance here. You throw a leg over it, you stand it up, and it's like a feather. You just don't expect it to be that light. It's perfectly sized for, I'm 5'10", I fit this bike perfectly. I've had, Bodyman Ron is like, he's like 6'2", 6'3". He's ridden this thing, and he actually looks kind of normal on it. So Yamaha pulled off this thing where a 5'2" woman, you know, somebody with a very short inseam, they can ride this bike and they can move it around as perfect, and a 6-foot+ guy can ride the same bike and not look like a monkey humping a football. It fits. It's a good sized bike. All right, the engine. There's a lot of good to say about this engine. So it's only a 250. It's a 60-degree V-twin. The other Yamaha V-twins are 70 degrees, but this is a 60. 250cc. It makes about 21 horsepower or thereabouts. But the cool thing about this engine is that they're trying to emulate the Harley look, right? The V-twin cruiser look, but it actually has more in common, let's say, like with a Ducati. It feels more like a 90 or even a 70 than it does a 45. And it's got a great exhaust note. Here, let me fire this thing up. Like I said, there's a lot of weirdness to, they put the key on the side. That's a nice touch. But listen to this exhaust. So you're out on the road on this thing, buzzing along 40 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour, like that's its really happy spot. You would never know it was a 250, or especially like a Yamaha. It has, I know it's gonna sound crazy, but it has like the closest thing I can relate to, like the sound is like a Ducati. It's just a smooth, happy, you know, it just rolls the revs out. It's rev happy. There's no tack, so you know, I have no idea what it's spinning, and like almost all Yamahas, it's geared a little on the low side. So, you know, a sprocket and a sprocket change could help. So it has just enough power to be viable. All right. So now, when I say viable, you can use this bike in just about every situation you're going to come across. It'll cruise all day at 70 on the interstate. It'll run at 80, but it really is not happy there. But it'll do it. You know, the top end on this is like 85, 90 miles an hour. But you know what? I never bothered to try to find it. You don't want to go that fast on it. A light bike like this, it starts to get affected by crosswinds and ripples in the roads and stuff like that. So if you got to do the interstate, yeah, 70 miles an hour, hang in the right lane, but it'll do it all day long. And it'll knock out 70 miles to the gallon while it's at it. It gets a legit 70 miles to the gallon. And it doesn't really matter if you're just running around town or you're covering mileage. It'll get that same 65, 70 miles to the gallon. Its happy place is 50 mile an hour and slower roads. It's super happy place where it's like, it just screams, oh, just ride me all the time, is at 30, 40 mile an hour winding country road, up and down the hills and everything else. It is just absolutely magic. It's not flickable. It's a light bike. You know, it's like a featherweight. But actually, my Sportster, which weighs 250 pounds more than this thing, is more flickable than this. Hard to put my finger on exactly why that is. It's a geometrical thing. I never bothered making calculations or making comparisons like that, but I could just tell you, seat of the pants, my Sportster feels more flickable. If you can use the word flickable and apply it to a Sportster, okay? But the Sportster feels more flickable than this thing. But it's willing, right? You know, no chicken strips on the side of those tires. It's not flickable, but it's light enough and it's low enough that you can get really aggressive in the turns and you can muscle the bike down and she'll stand right back up again when she's supposed to. It's very sure-footed bike. There's a lot to love about this thing. The styling, I can't say enough about the basic styling. Now, the earlier bikes all had these low bars, and the low bar fits the profile of this bike, okay? I mean, come on, look at that, right? The low bar fits. Now, some later versions had buckhorn bars, and some of them have a much higher riser setup with like sort of semi-buckhorn bar. But these low risers, the low risers and this bar is just perfect. And I'm not going to say it's got the perfect seating position, the position between the bars and the pegs, but it's close enough that you can ride it all day and, you know, it doesn't get fatiguing. It's a great bike. And, you know, the thing is, we let our, I'm as guilty of it as anybody, right? We let our preconceived notions and our prejudices get in the way sometimes of having a good time. And that's what happened with this. Once I just naturally kind of like would get on a bike and, you know, because it's available, and I got to really experience it and spend a good bit of time in the saddle, suddenly the silly little bike becomes like a friend. You know, it's like a happy friend that's just like always just like, let's go. You know what I mean? It's like the perfect bike. You just got to make a quick run to the store, or you got errands and stuff like that. It's perfect. The Sportster, a heavier bike, yeah, it's not really the same. It's like it becomes kind of a drudgery when you've got to just, you know, you're running around for errands, right? That type of thing. It's different when you're going out for a ride. You know, you're going to be on your motorcycle and you're going to do motorcycle things. But when you're just looking for something, you just want to run to the store real quick, or, you know, just scoot through the neighborhood, a 500, 600 pound bike becomes ponderous, and you kind of like don't spontaneously throw a leg over it to just go enjoy yourself. Like they kind of like there's like mental planning for it, if that makes any sense. With this thing, it's the exact opposite. It's always, anytime you walk past it, it says, oh, just throw a leg over and go for a ride, man. Let's go have some fun. It's a fun bike. You get over your prejudices, you know, like preconceptions, and mostly your ego. You have to kind of get over your ego. And then you could really start to find the fun and the virtue in bikes like this. And these things are around, like they're all over the place, because they've been selling them unchanged since 1988. There's a ton of them out there, and they can be had at a song. The parts are like so available, so cheap, because the bike's been sold all over the world for such a long period of time. It's the perfect beginner bike, and it's the perfect second or third bike. Like if you're an experienced rider, I would definitely not recommend this as your primary bike. You're gonna hate it. You'll be miserable. But as a second bike or like a third bike, you know, the one that you'll take out when the roads are a little snotty, and you know you don't feel like cleaning your bike for 2 days afterwards, right? Well, this is the one to use. It's the bike to keep around for when a friend wants to come with you. It's a perfect bike to keep around when you want to teach somebody how to ride. It's just a happy companion type of motorcycle. I'll give it back to my kid. You know, it's definitely not a keeper. I'm not going to add this to my fleet permanently. I'll give it back to my kid, but not until he asks me for it. In the meantime, it's going to be my companion in the morning. Right after my cup of coffee, we go enjoy the Tennessee countryside on our little 250 Virago. I'll see you tomorrow.